Welcome, everyone. My name is Wolf Pamphile. This is Haiti Policy House, and we are a think tank based in Washington, D.C. that focuses primarily on foreign policy issues that are impacting Haiti. And today we will dissect what does it mean for a country to have gangs, and is the term gang the right label for Haiti? So I'm going to introduce Millie Harron, who wrote this amazing article called The Revolutionary Forces of the G9 Family and Allies, introducing a new typology of violent actor. So, Millie, I will pass it on to you. So, tell us a little bit about you, your education background, the reason why you wanted to write this article to begin with.
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for having me and for the warm welcome. As you said, my name is Millie Harron. I completed my undergraduate degree at the University of British Columbia in political science and anthropology. After that, I took a gap year and I spent that year working with the Canadian Association for Security and Intelligence Studies, which is what sort of led me to the basis of doing this research. I then did my master's at King's College London at the War Studies Department, and this research is a sort of revised version of my thesis, which looked at Haiti in the contemporary context and what are we seeing today and what are we not seeing? What's concealed behind the labels of gang violence and all these sort of things. So I currently work as an advisory associate for Dragonfly Intelligence, which is based in London, and we are a geopolitical intelligence firm. So when I was undertaking this research, I was completing my master's while still working for this organization in Canada on the side, which through that organization, I just got so much exposure to so many people that were doing work in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And through that, I got a lot of freedom to also look at the things that I wanted to look at and the things that interested me. And I think what happened in Haiti, I think sparked my curiosity in a lot of ways about how we can understand what's happening in a more accurate and helpful way.
Thank you for that. I know. So we're going to dive into this new term. I mean, it's not new, but it's new for our region and the country. But the um, the new typology of violent actor, you call it a hybrid violent actor. Can you tell us more about that? Like, where did that come from, and what?
I largely have to credit a lot of the framework of the methodology of this research to Candace Kelschel and Natalie Achitowski, who came up with this terrorism and extremist matrix. And what this matrix essentially does is provides a breakdown of the key characteristics and essentialisms of organized crime groups, of gangs, of terrorists, and of these violent hybrid actors. So it gives quite a clear an overview of something that often lacks clarity and is overwhelmingly framed by blood boundaries and is just quite difficult to dissect. So when, for example, we look at things like gangs in the global north, we look at this as predominantly being discrete and highly localized. And with the acknowledgement that there's no internationally agreed upon definition, the UNGC does say that it's serious criminal offenses, three or more members, with not always defined roles. We look at these sort of gangs in the global south, you tend to see that they have much more of an overlap with state institutions in a way that you wouldn't see in the global north. We're looking at hybrid violent actors. It's I think the best way to look at it is sort of a amalgamation of these borrowed tactics and these borrowed characteristics from a range of other actors to create something that, as as it's accurately termed, is hybrid.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that when I first came across your paper, I was like, huh, I've never I mean, we all got the inkling that there is something more to the gangs in Haiti. Like they're not just gangs because they do have some level they do have power, right? And they do have control over a large amount of areas. And they also work in a way, or they recruit in a way that is very similar to other organizations. Like, if you're talking about when ISIS first propped up, they were all over social media. I mean, it's not to the level of ISIS, but at the same time, you see barbecue on TikTok talking about the revolution and fighting the corrupt system. And, it's like it's a very, it's like a call to action to young people who may fall for it. And yeah, so I think that's very different from what we've seen before in gang activities in Haiti.
I think with gangs you tend to see this, one of the predominant traits is that they are highly localized. They will have one specific sort of foothold in a territory, in a neighborhood. And what you've seen with G9 is this complete orientation about being goal driven and geared towards profit maximization. And it's spread across the country and it's having, regional influence. And you're just seeing all of these things that are just incompatible with how we would traditionally think about these sort of actors. So when we are looking at their sort of capacity for all of these things, as you said, with like ISs, you can start to draw these similarities between, characteristics aligning more closely with other groups than they do an actual prototypical gang.
Yeah. And so you talked about, you mentioned global north and global south when it comes to gangs or labeling the term gang. What do you think is the difference? I mean, for folks who may not understand the concept of global north and global south, they may see, let's just compare the US and Haiti essentially, or the UK and another country like Pakistan or Jamaica, something like that. So tell us more about that difference between the word gang and the global north and global south.
The first sort of big caveat to this conversation is that the trajectory of criminality in the global south and probably post-colonial states more generally is just entirely different than what you would see in the US or in Canada. If a criminal group in Canada or the US was shutting down airports, was taking over oil terminals, was displacing, 500,000 people, it would be, red flags all over. But in Haiti, it's, this is the reality and this is what happens. So I think the other side of that conversation is that gangs in the global south or violent groups in the global south have tended to be observed as overlapping with state institutions or even in some cases acting with power parallel to states. And they've also often been observed to provide security and essential services in the absence of state institutions. And that's something that we talk about in the literature as being governance voids. And this is something that has allowed them to expand and consolidate their legitimacy along the population. You can also see this in Haiti. The gangs in G9 have been known to operate critical social services, such as schools and medical clinics in the place of an absent government. So I think that foothold that violent groups are able to get in the absence of state institutions is hugely impactful and a big determinator in how they are able to expand and consolidate and gain that legitimacy.
Well, and there's a, well, in your research, I kind of noticed that you focus primarily on G9 instead of Viva Sum. Is there a reason for that?
G9 just seemed to be to encapsulate all of these things that I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at violent actors specifically and a violent actor and how you can look at Haiti's history and its trajectory and sort of mark and track the emergence of something like G. So it was a more sort of focused area of research for me. But of course, Viva Sam is a very important part of the conversation. And I think that that sort of overlap or collaboration, if you will, with GPEP is also another indication that you're probably looking at something that's not really acting as a gang. This is not typical behavior that you would associate with gangs. Say that, credit where credit is due. This is the research from Kelshul and Artachowski that I was talking about, and it's just a bit more of a distilled and refined version that I sort of teased out what I saw as the key characteristics for the purpose of this research, which we can run through. Right, so there it is. So the sort of backstory to this typology is that the two researchers were reading Charles Handy's Gods of Management. And in this book, he comes up with 5 different types of gods of management, and he bases them on on Greek gods with all of their different characteristics. And they sort of took that and interpreted it in a way that you could attribute these characteristics to different violent actors. So what you have here is a few of the key characteristics, and then you can map it between gangs, organized crimes, terrorists, and hybrid violent actors. So if we look at something structure, for example, we'll start at the top and make it nice and easy. Hybrid violent actors, their structure is characterized as having one centralized core. And this is something that we see in terrorist groups, which tend to have a small insular command group, as well as organized crime syndicates, which are very centralized. So in G9, you can see a structure that extends beyond gangs just managed systems, and it applies the centralized core. And you can see this through Cherizier's chief leadership role in conjunction with having senior members of his Delma 6 gang that he had before he fully formed G9. Whereas if we look at something like motivation, you can see that a motivation for a gang is predominantly geared around power projection. Organized crime, this is about reputation. Terrorists, this is about goals and being mission focused. I would argue that hybrid actors are identified as being both goal oriented and driven by profit. And this, when we apply it to G9, you can see that Cherizier is very goal oriented in his pursuit of forcing the removal of current Prime Minister Henri from office and quote unquote freeing Haiti, as he says. And that's been both consistently stated and outwardly pursued through a range of tactics which seek to weaken the state and delegitimize Henri's regime. We can also observe things like profit maximization when it comes to violent actors in their motivation. Has a range of economic profit activities, but not limited to extortion, kidnapping for ransoms. Since in 2023 alone, over 2,400 people in Haiti were kidnapped, which marked almost an increase of 120% to the year before. G9 also conducts electoral services in exchange for payments by political elites, and extortion is also a big part of what they do. So things like this immediately, you can see a contrast to traditional gangs where they're motivated by power projection. And the majority of gangs simply just would not have the capacity to engage in profit maximization or goal-oriented action to the same extent that G9 does. Move down to group objective there. We can see in our gang category that prestige is a key driver for them. Territory for profit is associated with organized crime, and political and ideological objectives are associated with terrorists. And when we come to hybrid actors, we can see that territory for profit is part of it, and that's something that they borrow from organized crime groups, as well as pursuing political and or ideological objectives similar to terrorists. So you can see that fusion already from organized crime and terrorists to form this hybrid. And when we look at G9 in this sense, we can see them seeking territory for profit through protection payment schemes where public institutions and private sectors operating in their territory are routinely forced to pay protection money in order to operate in the region. You can again see those political objectives come through Cherizier's statements about the current administration in Haiti and how he sees the future and what he sees as wrong with political institutions. If we look at capacity for violence for gangs, they are unpredictable, whereas organized crime groups have to apply a disciplined approach to violence. It's counterintuitive for organized crime syndicates to be front page of the news for gratuitous violence for no specific purpose. Terrorists, again, controlled and mission focused. They're quite disciplined in their approach, and so are hybrid actors. They demonstrate this discipline when they're violent, similar to organized crime groups and terrorists, with the caveat that some factions may still result to unpredictable uses of violence. So a very clear overlap between the three groups to produce this violent hybrid actor in this characteristic. We talked about Viva Sam and the truce with GPEP earlier, and I would argue that characteristic does demonstrate that they're disciplined. These are two groups that have tended to have very confrontational relationships with each other, but that willingness and ability to put aside gratuitous violence for strategic aims is not something that you would typically see with a group that's with just like a regular gang. So systematic targeting of key public and private institutions by G9 is well documented. And again, like terrorists, they can be controlled and mission focused rather as violence for the sake of committing violence. In terms of our violence rationale, so hybrid actors rationale their violence for being identified, in a threefold sense. So it tends to be about deterrence, expansion, and the attraction of media attention. Again, quite a contrast to just purely violence for power, which we see with gangs. G9 fuses market expansion from organized crime syndicates and violence to attract media attention from terrorists, which we touched on this earlier when we were talking about IS and propaganda and social media. Not common for gang leaders to be inviting reporters into their territories to be posting on social media. It's incompatible with operating a gang. So again, you're seeing these deviations. G9 has shown deterrence and expansion, that their affinity for this is pretty broad, and it's quantifiable in its offensive and defensive attacks to maintain and expand its territory. And yeah, the same thing with media attention, featured in numerous interviews and reports. He was described by one reporter as welcoming a succession of foreign reporters into his domain, which is particularly incompatible with traditional gang leaders who tend to extend considerable effort to remain unknown. And to just end this here with the group visibility, hybrid actors demonstrate a range of visibility across factions, where some factions will feature more prominently than others. And there are a number of well-known G9 affiliates who are highly visible within the political sphere in Haiti, and there are some that are not visible at all. So to sort of cap that off, I think this framework and this typology just gives you quite a bit of clarity and structure. And when we're looking at groups where you're not quite sure where they're going to place, you can just look at their characteristics and start ticking off boxes, and it will give you a lot of clarity about what you're looking at.
And now pivoting into a bit more of the policy talk, right? And what are the risks that comes with mislabeling a group like G9?
Well, I think it is critical, because I think what you tend to see is this misdiagnosis, and you end up treating sort of like for the wrong illness. As law enforcement and policy approaches to violent crime obviously differ significantly based on the type of actor being targeted. So you have to accurately classify to get an interdiction or a targeting technique that's going to be effective. While counterterrorism tactics will likely look at interdiction of ideological networks, and they might imply preventative and countering violent extremist programs. Anti-gang tactics, on the other hand, might look at community-based engagement initiatives and disrupting illicit markets. But if you're applying techniques for something that, if you were trying to treat a gang with terrorist tactics, it's probably not going to have the biggest impact. So understanding and using context-specific approaches, I think, is where that really comes to light. And I think governments and policy can often assume that violent non-state actors can be defeated through forceful and punitive responses. But we know from research that these kind of approaches can reinforce the beliefs that underpin violent activity in the first place, because they're not addressing core motivations and core intentions. And I think an example of this is we've seen this with the UN multinational security support mission. And I think that the mission was a law enforcement approach to an issue that is not purely a law enforcement issue.
And how would you name this issue? How would you call this issue?
Well, I think hybrid in nature is quite an accurate characteristic, because it's not just one or two things. And I think Haiti's context and its history is absolutely central to this conversation. G9 has not just popped up as the sort of first of its kind, and while it has sort of taken everything one step further, this is not something that's just sort of come about out of the blue. I think you can see it quite clearly from Duvalier and using non-state actors for political aims.
Okay. And if I know you talked about the MSS mission, what should international actors, well, one, let's say the Haitian government or other international actors, the UN, CARICOM, OAS, were reading this article, what would you like them to take away from this framework or this conversation too?
Yeah, I think as much as I am happy to put my hand up and say that it's not for me to sort of dictate or advise, what I would say is that invariably I would imagine that the solution will rely on nuanced and flexible and multidisciplinary responses. I think as much as we have to take into account that there are also actors that stand to gain from prolonging insecurity and conflict. And the penetration of criminality and criminal groups into critical government junctions in Haiti does facilitate this advanced form of state dysfunction that we're seeing. So what does it mean? I think obviously and most clearly the that the response will need to be Haitian led. And I think that's an absolute no brainer. But I think beyond that, I think institutional reform, dismantling the structures that facilitate, encourage, promote, benefit from violence and insecurity is going to be quite a key factor. I would also imagine that establishing a transitional government composed of Haitians that do not have links to corruption or criminal enterprises or human rights violations, who can really support the state in rebuilding its justice system to prioritize accountability and rule of law. Other measures might look to anti-corruption reform, targeted aid, youth opportunity programs. I think G9 has been a big mobilizer for youth, and it's not a surprise. It's a call to action, I think, as you called it earlier, because there's limited options. So it's what can we redirect that energy and that attention towards. But I think interagency cooperation is going to be big. I would imagine that CARICOM, CCOP, all of these organizations will have a role to play. Capacity building exercises with law enforcement agencies. You see that G9 has equipment that often surpasses that of law enforcement and the military. So they need to be on equal footing as well.
Yeah. Wow. This is, I think, I'm very curious to see where, if you had to, extend this research beyond what it is now, like what areas you think were under researched or you would like to expand more on.
I think what I would like to look at is perhaps more of like a transnational and looking at the trends and patterns in the region more broadly. Like when you look to Venezuela, I would probably argue that Trinidad and Tobago is going to fit into this hybrid category. I think it was this morning that Trinidad and Tobago declared a state of emergency because of violent groups and prison networks, which is very similar to how Trinidad and Tobago got its start. Trinidad and Tobago is massively transnational, and it's built.
Wait, for the folks who don't know, what is a
Yes,
Trinidad? I can't even pronounce it.
Trinidad is another criminal enterprise that got its start in a prison system in Venezuela, because what happens sometimes in Venezuela is that the government has a sort of unofficial policy of handing control to some prisons over to crime bosses. So this again, you see this role of the state, you see this violence that transcends into state institutions, but it's massively transnational, and its sort of criminal portfolio looks at extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, illicit markets, cybercrime, all of these things. So it's that, and I think that group, because it's so massive and it's become, yes, as I've said, like transnational, presence in Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Chile as well. So I would be interested to sort of look at how these groups, what sort of takeaways you can draw from some of these groups having overlapping or sharing characteristics, and whether influence and tactics get sort of adopted by one group or another, and how this all plays together.
I guess one question that popped in my mind as we're talking about this, within the matrix that you showed, right? What are the likelihoods, or which out of the different actors, we're talking about terrorists, organized crime, gangs, which one is more likely or more likely to get to a place of truce/peace?
I think what's very interesting about that matrix is that there's room for flexibility within it. So you can have a gang and it can evolve into something else. And in law enforcement, the time to sort of target these groups for your opportunities for interdiction tends to be when it sort of fractures and something new, or with a gang, if you've got certain people that are moving to being an organized crime syndicate, for example, and you have to get into a bit more discipline with violence in your operations, and there are people that don't line up with that and they're sort of pushed here, and then you have this group that it hardens and it becomes something more and big and stronger. I think understanding the sort of indicators for when that's happening and when it's sort of looking to go from one space to another is going to be key to sort of get ahead of it before it snowballs, for lack of a better term. Um, but for the hybrid actor, it's hard to say. I don't think it's well enough or widely enough applied that I could point to a case study that that it's been sort of dismantled or anything.
Uh-huh.
And we know the same, terrorists, we have similar issues. You can't kill an idea or an ideology. It's cutting a head off a snake sort of thing. So there's no simple answer, and I don't intend to simplify any of these things into something it's not. Yes.
I think you well put. I think one last question that I have is what's something that you've learned personally from this study, from understanding Haiti, the gangs, the social construct of Haiti?
Looking at things in the context of history and the big picture. Like, if you were to look at G9 as a sort of isolated event, you're sort of missing 95% of the picture. So I think context is everything, and that goes for Latin America, that goes for post-colonial states, as I was saying earlier about simply the trajectory of criminality looking different. I think you have to understand state institutions, state insecurity, history, pollution, all of these things, because it all contributes. Nothing that we're seeing today sort of anywhere has just popped up as sort of like an isolated event. So I think that holistic approach, that multidisciplinary approach was, and it was very difficult when I was doing the research for Haiti, because you can only have so many words in a dissertation. So I did have to sort of make a point to start and stop somewhere. But I'm interested to see. I would be interested to do more research into how, as I was saying before, everything connects more broadly in the region. I think that's quite an area of interest for me, and I think it's a little bit probably under researched about how history has informed contemporary contexts, and then what that also means for the present and the future.
Awesome. Listen, Millie, thank you so much for doing this. I'm truly grateful for the time, energy, brain space, brain power you put towards writing and studying Haiti and the gangs. And also, I think it's important to demystify organizations or terrorist organization gangs to not just one label, because again, that's how we get to bad policies. And I think you've done a great job at writing that and illustrating that. For those folks who are watching, please go and Google Millie Harron and find this article. It's called The Revolutionary Forces of the G9 Family and Allies, Introducing a New Typology of Violent Actors. We will link the article in the description, so feel free to click that and read it. And if you have any questions, you can always email us, and we will definitely get back to you. And also, if you have any ideas on topics that we should cover when it comes to Haiti, if you have ideas for articles, feel free to reach out to us. Again, it's www.haitipolicyhouse.org, and you're free to reach out to us anytime. So, Millie, again, thank you so much. Any last words you would like to say?
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to get to talk a bit more about the research and share it. And um, yeah, I'm sure we'll stay in touch. So if anything comes up in the future.
Thank you so much.